Sometimes the most expensive mistake isn't arriving 5 minutes late. It's judging someone 5 seconds too soon. The lunch crowd at Hawthorne Grill barely noticed when the young waitress pushed through the front door, her breathing uneven, her blonde hair slightly damp from the cold November rain. Claire Bennett glanced at the antique clock above the hostess stand, and for just a fraction of a second, the color faded from her face. 12:05. 5 minutes. Exactly 5 minutes. She closed her eyes before quietly tying her black apron around her waist, hoping she could slip behind the coffee station before anyone made a scene. She never got the chance. Stop right there. The restaurant fell strangely quiet as Richard Dawson, the general manager, stepped out from his office holding a clipboard against his chest. Every employee froze. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the steady rhythm of dishes clinking in the kitchen seemed to disappear beneath the weight of his voice. "You're late." Claire lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir. I know." "Do you?" he asked sharply. "Because we've discussed punctuality before." She nodded once. "Yes, sir." Ethan Brooks looked up from his corner booth for the first time since arriving. As one of the wealthiest investors in New York, he had attended board meetings where billion-dollar decisions were made with less tension than what now hung inside the small restaurant. He had eaten breakfast here every Friday for nearly 3 years. He knew the staff. He knew the manager. And he knew something else. Claire Bennett had never once seemed careless. She was the waitress who remembered every regular's favorite coffee without writing it down. She noticed when elderly customers needed extra time to stand. She quietly paid for a homeless veteran's breakfast one winter morning when she thought nobody was watching. Ethan had watched. He remembered everything. Richard's voice grew louder. "You were scheduled at noon. It is now 12:05. Claire swallowed carefully. "I understand. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Several servers looked toward her, silently begging her to explain. "Just tell him. Tell everyone. Defend yourself." Instead, Claire simply reached into her apron pocket, removed her name tag, and placed it gently on the hostess counter. "No, sir." Richard stared at her for a moment before speaking words that echoed through every corner of the dining room. "Then I have no choice. You're terminated, effective immediately." A quiet gasp swept across the room. Claire did not argue. She did not cry. She simply untied her apron with calm, careful hands, folding it as neatly as if she planned to wear it again tomorrow. Ethan found himself watching something unusual. Most people fought to protect their jobs. Most people pleaded. Claire did neither. She only looked toward payroll. "May I collect the hours I worked earlier this week?" Her voice remained soft, respectful. Richard crossed his arms. "Payroll is processed on Fridays. You'll receive it next week." Claire hesitated for the first time, barely noticeable. "I was hoping." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. "Never mind." She offered a small smile that somehow carried more sadness than tears ever could. "Thank you for the opportunity." She picked up her worn canvas bag from beneath the service counter. As she turned toward the entrance, something slipped from the side pocket and landed softly on the polished hardwood floor. Neither Claire nor anyone else noticed it. But Ethan did. He slowly stood from his booth, walked several steps across the silent restaurant, and bent down to pick up the object. It wasn't money. It wasn't a wallet. It wasn't a phone. It was a small plastic hospital wristband made for a child, its edges slightly worn, as though someone had been carrying it every day for weeks. Ethan stared at the tiny band resting in his palm. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Then he lifted his eyes toward Claire as she reached for the front door, completely unaware that the smallest thing she had dropped was about to change far more than her own life. Claire stopped with her hand resting on the brass handle of the front door. The familiar warmth of Hawthorne Grill was already beginning to fade behind her, replaced by the gray chill of a rainy Manhattan afternoon. Before she could step outside, she heard calm footsteps approaching across the hardwood floor. "Excuse me." Ethan Brooks held out the small hospital wristband. "I believe this belongs to you." Claire looked down, and for the first time since losing her job, genuine panic crossed her face. She accepted the wristband almost immediately, pressing it carefully against her palm as though it were made of glass instead of plastic. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not even realize I dropped it." Ethan noticed the way her fingers gently brushed across the printed letters before she slipped it safely inside her bag again. He did not ask any questions. Not yet. Claire offered one final polite smile to everyone inside the restaurant, even to the manager who had just dismissed her, then quietly disappeared into the steady rain. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Inside, conversation slowly resumed, but something had changed. The restaurant no longer felt as warm as it had only a few minutes earlier. Ethan returned to his booth, yet his breakfast sat untouched. He found himself staring through the window as Claire hurried down the sidewalk without opening an umbrella despite the cold drizzle soaking her light blue sweater. She never once looked back. "Your usual coffee refill, Mr. Brooks?" asked Megan, another waitress whose voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. "Please." Megan poured the coffee before quietly saying, "She was the best one we had." Ethan lifted his eyes. "Claire." Megan nodded. "She has worked here almost 4 years." She smiled faintly. Customers used to request her section weeks in advance. Ethan glanced toward the front counter where Claire had folded her apron with such quiet dignity. She did not seem like someone who would suddenly stop caring about her job. Megan looked around carefully before lowering her voice. She did not. Ethan waited. Every morning she arrived before almost everyone else. She covered shifts when people were sick. She stayed late without complaining. Last Christmas Eve, she worked a double shift so another server could spend the holiday with her children. She paused for a moment before adding, "That is why none of us understand today." Ethan stirred his coffee slowly. The silver spoon made a quiet circle against the porcelain cup. Did she offer any explanation? No, Megan shook her head. That is what makes it strange. Claire always explained everything. Today, she simply accepted it. Across the dining room, Richard Dawson was already speaking with another employee as though nothing unusual had happened. The clipboard remained tucked beneath his arm. His expression never changed. Ethan had spent decades building companies. He had interviewed thousands of people. Experience had taught him one lesson that rarely failed. Honest people often defended themselves. Truly selfless people sometimes did not bother, especially when protecting someone else mattered more than protecting themselves. His eyes drifted back toward the rain-covered window. Claire was already gone. Only blurred reflections remained on the wet sidewalk. "She carried that hospital bracelet every day," Megan said quietly. Ethan looked back at her. "You noticed?" Everyone noticed. Megan folded a napkin between nervous fingers. She always checked it before leaving for lunch, almost like someone checking family photographs in a wallet. Ethan remained silent. "Do you know whose it is?" he finally asked. Megan slowly shook her head. She never told anyone. Claire never talked much about her personal life. She would always change the subject whenever someone asked how she was doing. Ethan leaned back in the booth. Something about that answer settled heavily in his mind. The bracelet, the missing explanation, the request for her paycheck. None of the pieces fit together, yet somehow they belonged to the same story. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. His executive assistant answered before the second ring. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Ethan continued watching the rain outside. "Emily, I need you to find out everything you legally can about someone named Claire Bennett." There was a brief pause. "Is this business related?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Not yet, but I have a feeling it should be." Emily Carter had worked beside Ethan Brooks for almost 11 years, and during that time she had learned one important truth. He never investigated ordinary people without a reason. By the time Ethan arrived at his office overlooking Midtown Manhattan, a slim digital folder was already waiting on his tablet. He loosened his tie, set his untouched briefcase beside the window, and opened the file. It contained very little. Claire Bennett, 27 years old. Current address in Queens. No criminal record. No lawsuits. Excellent employment history. Volunteer work at 2 community food drives. Previous manager recommendations described her with nearly identical words. Dependable. Honest. Compassionate. Ethan frowned. None of it explained why a woman with such an exceptional reputation would quietly accept being fired without offering even a single excuse. His office phone rang softly. "Emily, there is something unusual," she said. "I contacted 2 of her former employers. They both told me the same thing." Ethan waited. Claire has never been late before today. Not once. Silence settled across the spacious office. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, traffic crawled through rain-soaked streets while gray clouds covered the skyline. Ethan had built his fortune by recognizing patterns. When something did not fit the pattern, he paid attention. He closed the file and looked at the city below. 5 minutes. A perfect employee does not suddenly become irresponsible after 4 flawless years. There had to be another reason. Meanwhile, several miles away, Claire stepped onto a crowded subway platform with her canvas bag resting against her shoulder. She checked the child-sized hospital wristband again before carefully returning it to the inside pocket. Around her, commuters hurried from one train to another, each carrying their own invisible burdens. Claire simply blended into the crowd. No one would have guessed that less than 1 hour earlier she had lost the only steady income she had. Her phone vibrated gently. A message appeared from an unknown number. It was not a job offer. It was a reminder. Pediatric cardiology follow-up appointment. 4 o'clock this afternoon. Please arrive 15 minutes early. Claire stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly whispering, "I will be there." She slipped the phone into her pocket and boarded the train. Across the city, Ethan was making calls of his own. "David," he said to the owner of a private security consulting firm his company occasionally hired, "I need a favor." "What kind of favor?" "Nothing invasive. Nothing unethical. I want to understand what happened this morning before an innocent person loses more than her job." David laughed softly. "You already think she is innocent." Ethan turned toward the rain-streaked glass. "I think there is a missing chapter in the story." Less than 2 hours later, another report arrived. It was shorter than the first, but far more interesting. Hawthorne Grill security footage confirmed Claire entered the restaurant at exactly 12:05. What happened before noon remained unknown because the restaurant cameras only recorded inside the building. Ethan read the report twice before setting it aside. "Find out how she traveled to work," he quietly instructed Emily. "Taxi, subway, bus, rideshare. I do not care. Start with the route." Emily hesitated. "That could take some time." "Good." Ethan looked back toward the city below. The truth usually does. At nearly the same moment, Claire stepped out of the subway and walked toward St. Margaret Children's Medical Center. The hospital stood only 3 blocks away, its white stone entrance glowing beneath the overcast sky. She smiled politely at the receptionist, who immediately recognized her. "Good afternoon, Claire." "Good afternoon, Linda. He has been asking about you all morning." Claire's tired expression softened for the first time that day. "Is he awake?" Linda nodded warmly. "He refused to take his afternoon nap until you came." Claire thanked her quietly and walked toward the pediatric wing with familiar steps, as though she had traveled the same hallway hundreds of times before. Ethan, sitting alone 30 floors above Manhattan, could not possibly know that while he searched for answers inside reports and timelines, the woman he was trying to understand had already reached the place where every secret she carried had quietly begun. Claire paused outside room 214 before quietly opening the door. The cheerful colors painted across the pediatric walls could not completely hide the quiet reality that many children inside the hospital measured time differently than everyone else. Some counted birthdays. Others counted treatments. As soon as the door opened, a little boy with light brown hair looked up from his coloring book and smiled so brightly that the weight on Claire's shoulders seemed to disappear. "You came," he whispered. "I promised I would." Claire walked over and gently sat beside his bed. "I have never broken a promise to you, Oliver." The 7-year-old reached for her hand without hesitation. The small hospital wristband Ethan had returned only hours earlier had once belonged to him, and although he had received a new one after every admission, Claire had quietly kept the very first bracelet from the day they met. It reminded her that hope could survive even the hardest seasons. "Did you lose your job today?" Oliver asked with the blunt honesty that only children possessed. Claire blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" He shrugged with an innocent smile. "Miss Linda said you looked sad when you walked in." Claire laughed softly, the sound almost disappearing beneath the steady hum of medical equipment. "I suppose she knows me too well." Oliver lowered his eyes. "Is it because you stayed with me this morning?" Claire gently brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. "None of that matters now. But it does." His voice became quieter. "You missed work because I was scared." Claire squeezed his hand. "You were not scared alone." Earlier that morning, Oliver had experienced unexpected complications after a routine overnight observation. The nurses had everything under control within minutes, but Claire had stayed beside him until his breathing settled and his smile returned. When she finally glanced at the clock, she had realized she would be late. She could have left sooner. She could have protected her job. Instead, She had remained in the chair beside a frightened child who simply needed someone familiar to tell him everything would be all right. She never regretted that choice. Several miles away, Ethan received another call from David. I traced part of her route, David said. Your waitress left Queens before sunrise, but she did not travel directly to the restaurant. Ethan stood from his desk. Where did she go? St. Margaret Children's Medical Center. Ethan remained silent. She stayed there for almost 3 hours before heading toward Hawthorne Grill. Ethan slowly walked toward the large window overlooking Manhattan. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets shining beneath the afternoon light. Do we know why she was there? Not yet, David replied. Hospital privacy laws prevent us from accessing medical information, and I have no intention of crossing that line. Ethan nodded to himself, even though David could not see him. Nor do I. He ended the call and stood quietly for several moments. The missing chapter was beginning to take shape, but the pages were still incomplete. Back at the hospital, Dr. Melissa Grant entered Oliver's room carrying a clipboard. She smiled warmly when she saw Claire. I had a feeling you would still be here. Claire stood politely. How are his test results? Better than this morning, the doctor replied. He is responding well. Oliver grinned proudly. I told you I was getting stronger. Dr. Grant looked toward Claire with genuine appreciation. You have a remarkable way of calming him. Every nurse on this floor notices it. Claire smiled. He is the brave one. After the doctor left, Oliver reached beneath his blanket and handed Claire a folded piece of construction paper covered with uneven crayon drawings. It showed a smiling waitress holding the hand of a little boy beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, he had written in large crooked letters, Thank you for never leaving me alone. Claire looked at the drawing for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it inside her canvas bag beside the hospital wristband. She had arrived at work 5 minutes late that morning carrying both of those reminders, never imagining that one represented the child she refused to abandon and the other would become the first clue leading a stranger named Ethan Brooks toward a truth that was only beginning to reveal itself. That evening, the lights in Ethan Brooks's office remained on long after the surrounding skyscrapers had grown dark. A single file rested on his desk, but he barely looked at it anymore. Instead, he kept replaying the same image in his mind. Claire standing in the middle of Hawthorne Grill, quietly folding her apron instead of defending herself. It no longer felt like the reaction of someone hiding a mistake. It felt like the silence of someone protecting something more important than herself. His phone vibrated. David was calling again. Ethan answered immediately. Tell me you found something. I did, David replied. Not through private records. Through public traffic cameras. Ethan leaned forward. Go on. I reconstructed most of Claire's route this morning. She left the hospital at 11:23. Under normal traffic, she would have reached the restaurant before noon. Ethan frowned. But she did not. No. At approximately 11:42, traffic stopped near Lexington Avenue because several pedestrians gathered at a crosswalk. One camera shows Claire stepping off the bus. Ethan remained silent. David continued. She was not running toward work. She was running toward a little boy who had become separated from the adult walking with him. Ethan looked toward the city lights outside his office. Was the child hurt? No serious injuries according to the public incident report. He became frightened, stumbled near the curb, and several strangers rushed over. Claire stayed with him until emergency responders located his grandmother a few minutes later. Ethan closed his eyes. How long? About 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Ethan quietly repeated the number in his head. 8 minutes spent helping a frightened child. 5 minutes late to work. 1 lost job. The math suddenly felt unbearable. There is something else, David added. The responding officer filed a short statement thanking an unidentified woman for remaining calm and comforting the child until family members arrived. Security images clearly identify that woman as Claire Bennett. Ethan slowly lowered his phone onto the desk after the call ended. The room felt impossibly still. He had spent decades rewarding people for ambition, discipline, and efficiency. Yet none of those qualities compared to what Claire had chosen that morning. She had looked at the clock, looked at a frightened child, and without expecting recognition or reward, chosen the child. Across the city, Claire sat beside Oliver's hospital bed while he slept peacefully beneath a soft blue blanket. The hallway outside had grown quiet. Nurses walked with measured steps beneath dim evening lights. Claire carefully unfolded the crayon, drawing once more. Thank you for never leaving me alone. Her eyes lingered on each uneven letter before she smiled to herself. You would have done the same for me, she whispered, even though Oliver was asleep. She slipped the drawing back into her bag beside the hospital bracelet. Inside that worn canvas bag rested everything that mattered most to her. A child's drawing, a plastic wristband, a wallet containing less than $40. And now, no job waiting for her tomorrow morning. Yet regret never crossed her face. She quietly stood, adjusted Oliver's blanket, thanked the night nurse, and began walking toward the hospital exit. At the same moment, Ethan pressed the intercom on his desk. Emily. Yes, Mr. Brooks? Tomorrow morning, I want to visit Hawthorne Grill before it opens. There was a brief pause. May I ask why? Ethan looked down at the printed traffic stills David had just sent him. One photograph showed Claire kneeling beside the frightened child on the sidewalk while traffic continued around them. Nobody in the picture appeared to notice her except the little boy reaching for her hand. Ethan stared at that image for a long moment before quietly answering. Because someone lost her livelihood for doing exactly what every decent human being hopes another person would do for their own child. And I intend to find out why nobody there cared enough to ask what happened before they judged her. The next morning, Hawthorne Grill looked almost peaceful before the breakfast rush began. Fresh coffee filled the air. Chairs scraped softly across the hardwood floor as servers prepared their stations. Nothing about the restaurant suggested that only 24 hours earlier someone had quietly walked out carrying the weight of an unfair decision. Ethan Brooks arrived 10 minutes before opening. He was not there for breakfast. He was there for answers. Richard Dawson looked surprised to see one of his most loyal customers standing at the entrance so early. Mr. Brooks, he said with a practiced smile. We are not open just yet. I know, Ethan replied calmly. I was hoping to speak with you before your staff arrives. Richard welcomed him into the empty dining room. The same corner booth where Ethan usually sat remained untouched. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, painting long golden reflections across the polished floor. Ethan remained standing. I have been thinking about yesterday. Richard nodded confidently. Unfortunate situation, but punctuality is important in this business. Ethan studied the manager's face for a long moment. Did you ask Claire why she was late? Richard blinked. She had the opportunity to explain herself. That was not my question. A brief silence settled between them. Richard shifted uncomfortably. No, I did not ask. Ethan nodded slowly, almost to himself. Did you know she had never been late in 4 years? Richard folded his arms. One mistake can still have consequences. Even after 4 years of loyalty? Richard hesitated. Rules have to apply equally. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed several printed photographs on the nearest table. Richard glanced down. The first image showed Claire kneeling beside a frightened little boy at a busy Manhattan intersection. The second showed emergency responders arriving while Claire remained beside the child. The third displayed the public incident report identifying an unnamed woman who stayed until the child's family was safely reunited. Richard's expression slowly changed. What is this? Ethan answered quietly. This is where Claire spent the 8 minutes that cost her the job you took away. Richard picked up the photographs one by one. The confidence that had filled his voice only moments earlier began to disappear. I did not know. Ethan nodded. Exactly. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. Somehow his calmness carried even greater weight. You did not know because you never asked. Richard looked down at the table. Around them, employees quietly entered through the back door, slowing their steps as they sensed the unusual conversation unfolding. Megan recognized the photographs immediately from where she stood behind the coffee station. Several others gathered silently nearby. No one interrupted. Ethan looked toward the windows where morning commuters hurried along the sidewalk outside. Leadership is not measured by how quickly you enforce rules, he said softly. It is measured by how carefully you seek the truth before making decisions that change someone's life. Richard lowered himself into a chair. For the first time since Ethan had known him, the manager appeared genuinely uncertain. Can I bring her back? Ethan remained silent for a moment before answering. That depends. Richard looked up hopefully. On what? On whether you want her back because you need a good employee, or because you finally understand what happened. The question lingered in the quiet dining room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Megan slowly wiped away a tear before turning back toward the coffee machine. She had watched Claire cover shifts, comfort grieving customers, celebrate birthdays with regular guests, and quietly leave generous tips for struggling coworkers who never knew where the money came from. Somehow hearing the truth spoken aloud made the loss feel even heavier. Ethan gathered the photographs and slipped them back into his folder. "There is still one piece of this story I do not understand," he said. "Yesterday she asked only for the wages she had already earned. She never mentioned the child. She never defended herself. She accepted everything in silence." Richard whispered, almost to himself, "Why would anyone do that?" Ethan looked toward the front door, where Claire had disappeared into the rain the previous afternoon. Because some people believe kindness loses its value the moment it becomes a performance. The restaurant grew completely still, and for the first time since Claire Bennett had walked away wearing nothing but quiet dignity, everyone inside Hawthorne Grill finally realized they had never truly seen the woman who had served them every single day. After leaving Hawthorne Grill, Ethan did not return to his office. Instead, he asked his driver to take him to St. Margaret Children's Medical Center. He carried no photographers, no assistants, and no intention of announcing who he was. For the first time in years, he wanted to understand someone without the influence of his name or his fortune. The hospital lobby was quiet beneath the gentle afternoon sunlight. Families moved through the hallways carrying flowers, balloons, and coffee cups. Nurses smiled warmly as they passed one another. And somewhere down the corridor a child laughed so freely that the sound echoed through the building like hope itself. Ethan approached the reception desk. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I am trying to locate someone named Claire Bennett. I believe she volunteers here." The receptionist recognized the name immediately, but hospital policy guided every answer she gave. "I am sorry, sir. I cannot share information about patients or visitors." Ethan nodded respectfully. "I understand. Would you be willing to tell her that someone hopes to thank her?" Before the receptionist could answer, a familiar voice drifted from farther down the hallway. "Miss Claire, look what I made." Ethan turned instinctively. Nearly 30 feet away, Claire walked slowly beside Oliver, who was now dressed in comfortable clothes instead of a hospital gown. The little boy proudly held a paper airplane decorated with bright blue stars. Claire laughed as it glided only a few feet before landing softly on the polished floor. "I think it flew farther this time," she said. "That means we are improving. Tomorrow it will reach the window," Oliver declared with complete confidence. Claire smiled. "Then tomorrow we will celebrate." Ethan remained where he was, watching quietly. There was nothing extraordinary about the conversation. No dramatic speeches. No grand gestures. Only patience, kindness, and the calm presence of someone, making a frightened child believe that tomorrow would be brighter than today. A nurse approached Claire carrying a clipboard. "Oliver's grandmother is finishing the discharge paperwork." Claire nodded. "Wonderful news." The nurse smiled warmly. "You know, he has been asking for you every morning." Claire looked toward Oliver, who was carefully folding another paper airplane. "Children deserve someone who keeps showing up." Those simple words stopped Ethan where he stood. He had spent his career investing in companies, buildings, and ideas. Yet standing in that hallway, he realized the rarest investment in the world was simply showing up for another human being without expecting anything in return. As Oliver's grandmother arrived, the little boy wrapped his arms around Claire in a grateful hug before reaching into his backpack. "I almost forgot." He handed her a small envelope decorated with colorful stickers. "You have to open it after I leave." Claire accepted it carefully, as though it contained something priceless. "I promise." Oliver waved enthusiastically as he walked away holding his grandmother's hand. Claire remained standing until they disappeared through the elevator doors. Only then did she quietly wipe a single tear from the corner of her eye. She never noticed Ethan standing nearby. He considered walking over immediately, but something stopped him. For the first time in many years, he felt uncertain about the right words. How do you thank someone who quietly gives pieces of herself to strangers every single day? How do you apologize for remaining silent while another person was judged unfairly? Claire found an empty chair near the window and finally opened Oliver's envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper. Written in uneven handwriting were only 2 sentences. "Thank you for staying with me when everyone else was busy. When I grow up, I want to be kind like you." Claire closed her eyes for a moment and held the letter gently against her heart. Ethan watched from across the hallway, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle inside his chest. In that quiet moment, he understood something no business report, security camera, or public record could ever explain. Claire Bennett had never measured success by what she earned. She measured it by the lives she quietly left a little less afraid than she found them. And suddenly Ethan realized that he was the one with the greatest lessons still left to learn. Claire carefully folded Oliver's letter and slipped it into the same canvas bag that carried the hospital wristband and the child's drawing. To anyone else it looked like an ordinary worn bag. To her it held the only treasures she truly valued. As she stood to leave, she finally noticed the man waiting quietly near the window. Ethan Brooks did not step forward immediately. He simply offered a respectful smile, the kind that carried no expectation. Claire recognized him at once. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "I did not expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Ethan admitted with complete honesty. "At least not until yesterday." Claire looked slightly puzzled but remained calm. "Is everything all right?" Ethan nodded. "May I buy you a cup of coffee?" She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "The hospital cafeteria serves decent coffee. It is less expensive than most places in Manhattan." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then the cafeteria, it is." A few minutes later they sat across from one another beside a large window overlooking the children's garden. Outside, colorful pinwheels turned slowly in the afternoon breeze while families walked along the brick paths. For several moments neither of them spoke. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm paper cup before finally breaking the silence. "I owe you an apology." Claire looked surprised. "For what?" "For standing there yesterday while you were dismissed." She gently shook her head. "You did not fire me." "No," Ethan replied quietly. "But I had the influence to ask questions, and I did not ask them until it was too late." Claire studied him for a moment before offering the same gentle smile she had given countless strangers over the years. Most people only see the moment in front of them. They do not see the hours that came before it. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I know the truth now." Claire remained silent. "I know about the frightened little boy at the intersection," he continued. "I know you stayed until his family arrived. I know you chose another person's child over your own paycheck." Claire looked out toward the garden instead of responding immediately. "He was crying," she finally said. "Children should not have to wonder whether someone will stop to help them." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Why did you never tell your manager?" She gave a small shrug. "He had already decided what kind of person I was." Sometimes explanations sound like excuses after a decision has already been made. "You could have saved your job." Claire slowly stirred her coffee. "Maybe. Then why did you not try?" She looked back at him, her blue eyes calm and steady. "Because the little boy deserved my full attention, not the feeling that I was helping him only so I could defend myself later." Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without losing his composure. He had spoken before thousands of investors without searching for words. Yet now none of that experience mattered. "Yesterday," he said quietly, "I believed I was watching someone lose a job." He paused. "Today I realize I was watching someone protect her character." Claire lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I only did what I hoped someone would do if it were a child I loved." Ethan felt a sudden weight settle inside his chest. Memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit surfaced without warning. Years earlier, when his younger sister had been involved in a frightening accident as a teenager, it had been a stranger who stayed beside her until family members arrived. He had never learned that person's name. He had only remembered that one act of kindness had changed the way his family viewed humanity forever. His eyes became noticeably wet. He looked away toward the garden, trying to compose himself, but the emotion refused to disappear. Claire quietly reached across the table and slid a single paper napkin toward him without saying a word. It was such a simple gesture, offered with the same quiet dignity she seemed to offer everyone. Ethan let out a slow breath and accepted it. "I have spent my entire life believing success was measured by what we build," he whispered. "You reminded me that it is measured by who we become while building it." Claire smiled gently. Then perhaps yesterday was not a complete loss after all. Ethan looked at her through eyes that could no longer hide the tears gathering there. And in that quiet hospital cafeteria, he understood that the greatest fortune he had encountered was not sitting in a bank account or a boardroom. It was sitting across from him, disguised as an unemployed waitress who had never once asked the world to notice her goodness. 3 months passed. and winter quietly gave way to the first signs of spring. The morning sun poured through the windows of Hawthorne Grill, but something inside the restaurant had changed in ways that could not be measured by new furniture or fresh paint. A small bronze plaque now rested beside the entrance where every employee and every customer could see it before walking inside. It read, "5 minutes can cost a job or save a life. Always learn the whole story before judging another person." No one knew who had written the words, but every member of the staff knew why they were there. Richard Dawson still worked at the restaurant, but he was no longer the same manager. Before making difficult decisions, he listened first. Before correcting an employee, he asked questions. More than once, younger servers noticed him quietly reminding new supervisors, "Assumptions are fast. Understanding takes time." The lesson had become part of the culture. Ethan Brooks had never purchased the restaurant, despite rumors that spread through the neighborhood. Instead, he chose something Claire respected far more. He used his influence to establish a community assistance fund that helped hourly workers facing unexpected family emergencies. The program carried no corporate logo and no public announcement. It simply covered missed wages for people who had chosen compassion over convenience. When reporters later asked why he created it, Ethan only smiled and replied, "Because the world needs fewer perfect attendance records and more people willing to stop when another human being needs help." Claire politely declined every job offer Ethan, arranged through his business contacts. She thanked him sincerely, but explained that she wanted to earn her next opportunity on her own. A few weeks later, she accepted a position as a patient services coordinator at St. Margaret Children's Medical Center. The work paid only slightly more than waiting tables, yet every morning she walked through those hospital doors with the same quiet smile she once carried into Hawthorne Grill. She knew exactly where she belonged. Oliver recovered steadily. On the afternoon he was finally discharged for good. He ran across the hospital garden with the carefree confidence every child deserves. Before leaving, he handed Claire one last folded paper airplane. Across one wing he had carefully written, "Keep helping people fly." Claire laughed softly and placed it inside the same canvas bag that still held the hospital wristband and every handwritten note she had collected over the years. Some people carried expensive watches. Others carried designer wallets. Claire carried reminders that kindness always mattered. One Friday morning, nearly 4 months after the day everything changed, Ethan returned to Hawthorne Grill for breakfast. Megan recognized him immediately and smiled. "Your usual table?" Ethan nodded. "Please." As she poured his coffee, she noticed him looking toward the entrance where Claire had once stood holding her folded apron. "Do you miss seeing her here?" Megan asked. Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "Sometimes." He paused before adding, "But I think the children at St. Margaret need her more than I ever did." Megan looked toward the bronze plaque and quietly nodded. Before leaving, Ethan placed an envelope beneath his coffee cup. Inside was a donation for the Employee Assistance Fund along with a handwritten note addressed to the staff. It contained only one sentence. "Never become so busy enforcing rules that you forget to look for the person standing behind them." He walked out into the warm spring sunlight without waiting for anyone to thank him. Across the city, Claire stepped outside the children's hospital during her lunch break. She watched parents pushing strollers beneath blooming trees while children laughed. Around the small fountain in the courtyard, the breeze gently lifted a loose strand of her blonde hair as she looked toward the bright blue sky. She had lost a job, but she had never lost herself. And perhaps that had always been the greater victory. Life has a quiet way of revealing what uniforms never can. Titles fade. Wealth changes hands. Positions come and go. But character remains long after every paycheck has been spent. The people who change the world are rarely the loudest voices in the room. More often, they are the quiet ones who choose compassion when no one is watching, who protect another person's dignity even when it costs them something precious, and who walk away believing they have lost everything, never realizing they have already become the richest soul in the story.